In case you're new here, my name is Quinn the GM. Welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to be elaborating on some of my other videos, particularly in which I talk about Viserys' 1 and 2 and whether or not they were good kings. I wanted to give my broad opinion on all of the kings of Westeros and see just generally how everyone measures up to each other. So, starting this list off, and I think a pretty good way to start is at the beginning and at the end. So, Aegon the Conqueror is obviously an S tier. He is the one who started the entirety of the dynasty. He also held it together for 37 years after the conquest, which I think is more impressive than the conquest itself, as he had dragons. I think he was going to be able to conquer anything regardless. However, it is really impressive that he was able to bind the realm together via his strength and his composure as a ruler. And I think that kind of measured balance between the two is what has allowed him to be remembered as such a great king overall. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we have Aerys II, the Mad King. He's obviously going to be the lowest ranked king on the list. I've heard people say that another king is like the worst king, and we'll get to him. He's quite bad. But regardless of anything that he did, anything that caused war or anything like that, the dynasty remained intact. The Mad King was so bad that the Targaryen dynasty has all but died out by the time of the main series of A Song of Ice and Fire, and I put that mostly on the Mad King's doing, as he as a ruler was so personally just terrible after he went mad that everything kind of went bad. I mean, the dynasty had been in decline since they lost the dragons. However, overall, I think that it could have definitely survived had he not made the worst choices at every possible turn. And those worst choices mostly being really getting on Tywin Lannister's bad side, who had previously been good friends with prior, and killing Brandon and Rickon Stark, the two current leaders of Winterfell, and essentially sparking Robert's rebellion there, and along with his son Rhaegar, also sparking the rebellion. But yeah, continuing on from there, we'll start from chronological order from Aegon. Where is Aenys? Where is Aenys? Here he is. Aenys is going to go in the D tier as maybe C. C, D, C, D. I'm going to put Aenys at the bottom of C for now. He might move down. Aenys was a very weak ruler. He did pretty much nothing throughout his entire reign and was pretty much just walked all over by everyone around him. And furthermore, he did not really solidify his succession in a real way, and that led to him having his son be usurped by his brother Maegor. And overall, I think that he was just really not a good king at all. He was kind of the blueprint for a fair few spineless kings that we will see in the future. That is a bit of a theme with some of the kings here. But yeah, no, Aenys is not a very good king at all. Going on to Maegor, I've seen some interesting thoughts on Maegor in the fan community as of late. And I don't disagree with all of them, in that Maegor personally is probably the worst person that was a Targaryen king. He was not a good person by any means. He committed countless atrocities on his family, on everyone around him, on the faith. However, I don't know if the Targaryen dynasty would have survived without him. He essentially took all power away from the faith. He was the one who disarmed the faith militant, which we see in A Feast for Crows and in A Dance with Dragons, is a massive factor in Westeros that can really flip everything on its head and really come to be the downfall of a ruler, as we see with Cersei. So Maegor overall, I think he was not a good king, but I also don't think that from a purely objective ruling the realm and solidifying the dynasty standpoint, he was that terrible of a king. I think he's better than his brother was. I'm going to put him mid C tier, probably top end of C tier there. Jaehaerys is easy S tier. He is like the best king of Westeros when people typically rank the kings of Westeros, as he was pretty much the longest ruling king, and he instituted a ton of laws. He built roads. His wife, Good Queen Alysanne, was great. She had a lot of influence on his policy, particularly him outlawing the First Night, which is a really great accomplishment. That was a great thing that he did, and he had a number of really good accomplishments. Only downsides to Jaehaerys being sexism. He was quite rude to pretty much all women all the time, including his own daughters, who he was incredibly cruel to in certain cases, Sarah specifically. And he also left some succession issues in his wake, particularly not naming Rhaenys as his heir, who I think would have been much more suited to the crown than Viserys was. However, that was not really necessarily his fault, but he definitely could have solved it. But yeah, no, Jaehaerys overall, solid S tier. Not really anything could contest that. Moving on to Viserys the First. I'm going to put him between these two, mid C tier. He didn't do much of anything. His reign was peaceful, but the peace ended immediately upon his death. He had a million chances to prevent the Dance of the Dragons from occurring, and he squandered every single one of them, which is quite impressive. Overall, I think my perception is also fairly skewed based on Paddy Considine's portrayal. The book Viserys is probably a little lower. I'd rank him probably under... I think that Viserys' time was generally more peaceful than Aenys's was, because there were rebellions immediately after Aegon's death, and plus I just like Viserys a little more, so I'm perfectly willing to admit my personal biases and put him above Aenys, which is kind of the middle of the pack of C tier here. Moving on from there, Aegon II, second D tier king. I think he's not as bad as the Mad King, but he was a pretty terrible ruler. He made very bad decisions during the Dance of the Dragons. He was pretty much ruled by those around him, much like his father was. And the worst part about Aegon II was him not really knowing when the Dance of the Dragons was over. He could have had peace at multiple points and still have won, but he insisted upon pursuing conflict and trying to kill anyone who had opposed him by any means necessary. And that was what led to his early death, essentially. And that was really a big blunder on his part overall. Moving on from him, Aegon III. And also, I should mention, Rhaenyra I would probably put as probably just above Aegon II. She was not great when she was in power, particularly in not regarding the small folk in any means. But she was also only in power during a war, while Aegon did have some time after the war that he was in power. Anyway, Aegon III, solid A tier. I think he does a lot to help the realm recover from the Dance of the Dragons, and he's also a fairly even-keel king, which is a fairly good thing when you're looking at all of this group of monarchs. I'd say he's easily the third best Aegon, which suits his name. Overall, though, he did not have the greatest interest in ruling. He was fairly depressed, which is not at all his fault, given the trauma that he went through as a kid. And he also hated dragons, which I'm sure did not really help the Targaryen dynasty's main source of power, being the flying lizard nukes. And his kids were pretty cool as well. Speaking of Daeron I, the young dragon, B-tier king. I think that had he been alive for longer, he could have been one of the best. However, he was very singularly focused. He was undoubtedly the best general Westeros has ever had as a king, bar none, even better than Conqueror, according to both the histories in universe and George R.R. Martin. However, he was very focused on bringing Dorne into the fold and did not really do anything else. It was essentially left to his uncle, Viserys II, who might help us later, to rule the realm in his stead while he was warring in Dorne. And it was this warring that eventually got him killed, which was quite short-sighted overall. Moving on to his younger brother, Baelor the Blessed. This is another tricky one. I'm debating between B and C. Top of C, bottom of B. I'm going to go B for Baelor. Not just because that's what his name starts with, but also because he did a lot of reforms that would have helped the peasant folk a fair bit, and he also peacefully brought Dorne into the fold, which is quite nice through the marriage of his sister Daenerys, though I would also credit Viserys more with that than he would be credited with that, as he was pretty singularly focused on his faith, similarly to his brother. But overall, I think he was a solid king for the time that he had, though had he lasted much longer, I think he would have been quite bad, as he probably would have gone to war with the Iron Isles and the North in order to enforce the worship of the Seven on all parts of the kingdom. Moving on now to Viserys II, S tier, easily, 100%, quote me. I don't think that I can objectively put him higher than Aegon or than Jaehaerys, but Viserys II is incredibly underrated. I've got a whole video on Viserys II, which you should watch if you haven't. But he is really good. He rules in the stead of all three of these kings. Part of the reason these three are so high is because they have Viserys as their hand of the king. He is taking care of business while they are sulking, warring in Dorne, or praying. that is said directly by Tyrion in A Storm of Swords, and I really like that comparison. He's very much a Richard III or Tyrion type figure, and that's why I love him. Viserys II, one of my favorite kings. My favorite king, one of the best kings. I order my tiers because it always annoys me when people don't order their tiers. If this is a just what Quinn thinks tier list, it looks like this. But if I'm trying to be even a little objective, I'm going to say Viserys is here. If he'd lived a few years longer, he would be here. And if he'd lived as long as Jaehaerys, he would be here. But, alas, life's not fair. Moving on from Viserys, we have Aegon the Unworthy. Aegon IV, second worst king of Westeros. I've often heard him touted as the worst king of Westeros. Personally, I don't think he's as bad as the Mad King, because the realm survives his reign, and it does not survive the Mad King's reign. However, he is very much a terrible king. Legitimizing all of his bastards on his deathbed was a horrible move that led to countless deaths and 80 years of war, which is why I think he's significantly worse than Viserys I, who is the other king who's pretty much credited with enabling wars. The Viserys has credit for killing the dragons. Aegon the Unworthy has credit for killing 80 years worth of soldiers, which is very much not a good thing. I am not a fan of that. Though the fact that the realm survived is good. And I also want to address something that I see on the comments of my Viserys video a fair bit, is that Viserys' worst flaw is that he was a bad dad. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, because you got to remember, Aegon is not the only child of Viserys. He has a sister who turned out fine, and Viserys also raised Aemon the Dragon Knight, who is known as one of the most admired knights in the history of Westeros. Supposedly the father of the next king, who might have been kind of born out of wedlock, and that might be the reason why Aegon decided to legitimize his bastards on his deathbed. But overall, I think that Viserys' record as a father is 2 for 3, and I don't think that Aegon's sin should be entirely held against Viserys at this point. Moving on from Aegon, Daeron the Good is another A-tier king. He is the good. He has a lot of good reforms. He handles the Blackfyre rebellions well. He's very level-headed. He's very wise. This is part of the reason why people think he's Aemon's son, because he does not resemble Aegon in the slightest. But I digress. I think he's a solid, good ruler. Aerys the First is next, I believe. Aerys the First can go to C tier, I think. Yeah, C tier. I'll give him C tier. Top of C tier. He, I think, is the most nothing king out of the entire Targaryen dynasty. He's just a vessel for Bloodraven or Brynden Rivers or the Three-Eyed Crow to rule the realm, which honestly maybe that'll bump him up to B tier for that, because Brynden Rivers did a pretty decent job of ruling the realm. He was not very bad at it at all. He really kept things in line and quashed a fair few Blackfyre rebellions, which is quite impressive. Though it was fairly brutal in ways that I don't think that Aerys necessarily would have wanted him to be if he had any spine whatsoever. But yeah, he's on the bubble. I could see him moving a little bit. Following him, Maekar, Maker's Mark. Another B tier. Okay, Maekar will be B tier. Aerys will be C tier. That makes sense. Maekar will also be above Baelor, because I think Maekar is a pretty good dude. We get to know him a little bit in the Dunk and Egg stories, and he seems pretty solid. I don't think he would have been as good as his brother, Baelor Breakspear, would have been, but I think he did a good job in some of the Blackfyre rebellions. I think he was a fairly serious man. I think anybody with the nickname The Anvil is not too bad at all. And I think he has probably the funniest method of death out of all of the Targaryen kings, which is getting hit by a catapult while crushing a meaningless rebellion by House Peak, which I'm just a big fan of. Not House Peak, just that method of death. Aegon V. Aegon V is probably A tier, top of A tier. I think he's one of the best kings. He is edged out of S tier by his two things: his inability to control his kids and Summerhall. His inability to control his kids alienated a lot of lords and led to kind of the diminishing of the dynasty, particularly due to Duncan the Small abdicating the throne, and he would have been a great king. But if Egg had been able to kind of strong-arm him into taking the throne, things might have gone a lot better in years in the future. Additionally, Summerhall wiped out a ton of House Targaryen, and we don't really know what happened there. That'll probably be a future Dunk and Egg story, probably the last one if I had to guess. But that massive disaster being under his watch has to be considered when placing him. However, he did do a lot of good. He was a very wise king, and he did a lot of reforms specifically tailored to the small folk, which is great. We get to meet him in Dunk and Egg and really get to know him, which I absolutely love. It's nice to see him growing up and see who this king is as a boy, see how he develops into the man he will become. And yeah, I think it's pretty great. I said a little while ago that Aerys the First might be the most nothing king. I take that back because Jaehaerys the Second, I think, is pretty much there just to give a buffer zone between Aegon the Fifth and the Mad King. Overall, I'm gonna say that Jaehaerys the Second is gonna be right about here. I think this is. I'll switch these two as well. I think this is the line between doing anything and actively harming. I think that Jaehaerys II is the perfect line between at this point. But yeah, that's the list. I think I'm pretty okay with all these placements overall. It's pretty even throughout. I'm happy with that, and C being the average makes sense. What do you think of this list? I'd love to hear your opinions. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, like the video, all that YouTube stuff. I really appreciate it. It helps me grow the channel a ton. And yeah, I love talking about this stuff. And I have a few more videos coming down the pipeline that I'm excited to share with you.